I went to a business meeting at a restaurant, one of those discreet, well-lit ones downtown, and sat at a table reserved by my advisor. It was an important, decisive meeting, one that could change the course of my career. The weather was overcast outside, but inside I was serene. What I didn't imagine was that night, which began like any other, would end as the silent breakup of my entire history with the woman I'd loved most in my life. As soon as I entered the restaurant, I noticed something strange, a familiar scent, a muffled laugh I knew by heart, a gesture that seemed rehearsed. When I glanced at the next table, I saw my wife, dressed as if she were going to a romantic dinner, sitting with my boss. They were so close, exchanging knowing smiles, it felt like time had frozen. For a moment, I thought I was delirious. But I wasn't. It was real. Every second of that encounter was like a stab. I got up, walked over to them, and she simply froze. She went pale, her eyes wide, her lips parted soundlessly, as if she'd been caught stealing something sacred. And I stood there, without saying a word, just staring into her eyes, trying to understand what I'd done so wrong to deserve this. My boss didn't even react. He just kept his gaze lowered, like a coward. I returned home without thinking, only feeling the pain growing in my chest as if something were tearing me apart. With each step to the apartment door, I felt the bitter taste of betrayal rising in my throat. When she arrived a few hours later, her face still slightly smudged with makeup and guilt, she sat across from me with a mixture of shame and cynicism. And she said that he, the man with whom she'd shared secret glances at the restaurant, made her feel valued. Valued, that word echoed inside my head. As if everything we'd experienced together had been insignificant. As if the birthdays, the sick days, the shared dreams, the sleepless nights caring for our young son had been nothing more than meaningless routine. I took a deep breath, didn't yell, didn't argue. I simply said, then our marriage ends here. And you can move on with your life with him. But don't look for me anymore. I grabbed a suitcase, my last bit of strength, and left the house as if burying a body. Mine. Those were days of silence. A heavy, painful silence, where all I saw was the shadow of us scattered throughout the house. The memories tortured me. Every corner reminded me of a detail. The pillow she chose, the dish she liked, the shirt she ironed with care. But even with my soul shattered, I moved on. I cut contact. I deleted photos. It hurt. It hurt as if a piece of me had been ripped out. But I had to move on. And I did. She, on the other hand, tried to continue what she'd started as if it were something solid. She tried to make my boss a new partner. But over time, what was once attraction turned into disinterest. He began to pull away. First, he stopped texting. Then, he declined invitations. Finally, he coldly told her he didn't want anything serious. That she'd confused things. And then she realized what she'd done. She'd traded true love for a moment of vanity. She opened her eyes too late. Because when she looked for me, when she showed up at the door of my new apartment with tears in her eyes and regret on her lips, she didn't find the man she'd left. She found someone stronger. And with someone else. And that's when the weight of choice fell upon her with all the force in the world. I forgave her. I forgave because those who truly love don't harbor hatred. But forgiving isn't about going back. Forgiving is about letting go. And that's what I did. She looked at me as if she were a stranger. And I was. I was a new man. A man rebuilt by pain. She tried to smile, to plead, to remember. But everything we had had died in the restaurant that night. And there was no point in trying to revive it. The months passed. Life went on. I met someone. Someone who didn't need hidden glances to feel special. Someone who knew how to love with presence, with truth. And she, well, she was left with silence. She tried to return to her routine, but the routine was now empty. Every corner of the house reminded her of what she'd lost. The mirror reflected someone more tired. Friends disappeared. Her cell phone went silent. And it was in this silence that regret was born. Some nights, she dreamed of me. She dreamed of our good times, of our wedding day, of our first trip, of the birth of our son. She dreamed that I was still there, waiting for her with dinner ready, with a sincere smile. But then she woke up. And the bed was empty. The side where I slept was just a cold sheet. And it was in that awakening that she understood what she had lost. It wasn't a man. It was a home. A shelter. A love that would never return. Her pain was now my own. And even with forgiveness, there was no going back. Because there are things that, once broken, even when put back together, never go back to the way they were. And there are people who, once they leave, even if they return one day, no longer belong in the same place. The curious thing is that night, when I found her with him, the world could have fallen apart. But that was the beginning of another path. Lonelier at first. More painful. But one that took me to a place of truth. And her? Well, she remained trapped in the memory of what she destroyed. Waiting, every night, for that side of the bed to be occupied again. But now, that space belongs to absence. To silence. To the emptiness of choices that cannot be undone. And the most impactful thing of all wasn't the betrayal. It was the coldness. The calm with which she tried to justify it, as if love were something disposable. As if it didn't hurt. As if it were simple to give up an entire life for a cheap compliment. And that's what still echoes in my mind from time to time. Not the act. But the lack of remorse at the moment when it mattered most. And yet, I forgave her. Because in the end, her true punishment wasn't my anger. It was my absence. It was seeing me move on, loving again, smiling with someone else. It was realizing that no matter how much she regrets, I'll never come back. But what she doesn't know, is that the night she came back, begging for forgiveness, saying she still loved me, saying she knew I made a mistake, and that she wanted to win me back, at that exact moment, I almost gave in. Almost. And perhaps what hurts her the most, to this day, is knowing how much I still loved her, and yet, I chose to move on without her. But what did she feel, that morning, alone, when she woke up from the dream that we were together again, and saw that her side of the bed was still empty? And worse, it always would be. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on painful realities, because the mission of this channel is clear: show how betrayal destroys homes, corrodes feelings, and changes lives forever. Get ready. What's coming next is a story. Intense, exciting and shocking. Feel. Reflect. And never forget, not all forgiveness rebuilds, and not all repentance brings back what was lost. Good story. Ethan and Clara met by chance one afternoon when he'd forgotten his home office key and decided to stop at a random cafe, between clients, to organize his emails while waiting for the duplicate to arrive. Clara was sitting at the next table, finishing an online interior architecture class, her large headphones nearly covering her ears and a notebook filled with chaotic notes. That's when she dropped a stack of papers on the floor, and he, without thinking, bent down to help her. She laughed nervously and thanked her quietly, while he smiled with a gentle ease, the kind that doesn't require much to be noticed. They chatted right there, as if they already knew each other, as if time were in no hurry. And suddenly, an oversight became the beginning of a story. Their relationship wasn't one that began with overwhelming passion, but with a rare connection, made of comfortable silences and sincere smiles. Ethan had that reserved, almost introspective manner that hid a deep and generous heart. He worked in commercial management at a mid-sized company and enjoyed stability. Clara, on the other hand, was more impulsive, emotional, with a keen aesthetic sense and a restlessness in her eyes. She saw beauty where no one else did, and this captivated Ethan from the start. The love between them grew like a house being built slowly, stone by stone, unhurriedly, but with great care. They married after 3 years of dating and moved into a small apartment, where every piece of furniture had a story and every wall carried their energy. In the early years of their marriage, Clara decorated their home with fresh flowers and handwritten quotes taped to the refrigerator, and Ethan would leave notes hidden among her books or make her coffee just the way she liked it, strong, with a touch of cinnamon. They laughed together over silly things, cried over old movies, argued over the color of the sofa, and made up at the end of the day with kisses that tasted like redemption. There was no excess, no luxury, but there was surrender. There was a silent commitment to being each other's shelter. As the years passed, life took on a different rhythm. Ethan's work became more demanding, with tight schedules, aggressive targets, and endless meetings. Clara, for her part, began to gain recognition in her field, receiving invitations for larger projects, more responsibility, and more exposure. This filled her with pride, but also unintentionally drove her apart. They began to live at different paces, with schedules that rarely coincided, dinners cancelled because of last-minute calls, weekends filled with deadlines and presentations. Small frustrations accumulated silently, and what had once been easily discussed became bottled up, swallowed, as if unwilling to burden the other with their own exhaustion. But there was still love. There was. Clara was moved to see Ethan fall asleep on the couch with a book in his lap. Ethan still stopped to watch the way she played with her hair when she was nervous. They knew they were entering a difficult phase, but they believed that, with time and patience, they would find their bearings again. They believed, perhaps, out of habit. Or out of hope. During their 8th year of marriage, they decided it was time to move. Clara dreamed of a larger space, a bright home office, and a kitchen with a central island. Ethan, reluctantly, eventually gave in, as he always did, and dove into the purchase process. He wasn't a fan of change, but he wanted her to be happy. This was his way of loving, doing whatever it took to make sure she had what she wanted. While Clara took care of the decorating details, Ethan focused on the financial side, calculating installments and adjusting the budget. Amidst all this, the time they spent together grew increasingly shorter. Conversations became messages, kisses became routines, touching became habits. But they didn't fully realize it. It was like a slow erosion, a silent and continuous wear and tear. Still, there were moments of respite. A night out to dinner and laughing like before. A quick trip that rekindled the flame for a few days. A lazy Sunday where they cooked together and shared wine. Small moments that, to Ethan, proved they were still there, enduring. He wasn't one for extravagant gestures, but his constancy was the pillar of their relationship. The way he listened, even when exhausted. The way he made a point of not going to bed angry. His concern for reminding her to eat when she was too absorbed in her projects. Clara, on the other hand, was beginning to feel a strange emptiness she couldn't name. It was as if she were surrounded by everything she'd ever desired, yet something was missing that she couldn't quite define. A different kind of affection, perhaps. A more intense validation. A kind of gaze that would make her feel unique again. And as much as Ethan was by her side, as much as he cared for her with his constant, silent presence, something inside Clara began to search for something outside. She would never admit it. Not even to herself. She was grateful for him, she knew how lucky she was. But there were days when her heart no longer leaped when he walked through the door. And that scared her. Not because she'd stopped loving him, but because she began to doubt whether she still loved him the same way. Maybe it was a phase. Maybe it was just the accumulation of responsibilities, the fatigue. She tried to compensate with kindness. She went back to cooking dinner. She wrote sweet messages throughout the day. She bought new clothes to rekindle her desire. And for a while, it worked. Ethan responded with more presence, more touch, more attention. But the hole in Clara was still there. Small, hidden, but growing. Ethan, for his part, didn't quite understand. He attributed her silences to fatigue, to being overwhelmed. It never crossed his mind that their love was threatened. He trusted her as one trusts the sun that rises every day. Clara was his home. His place of peace. And when he thought about the future, he thought of her by his side, growing old together, caring for their grandchildren, sharing a glass of wine on the porch of the house they were yet to buy in the countryside. This certainty kept him going, even when the day ended without her saying, "Good night." Even when the morning kiss came too quickly. Clara began accepting invitations to events she'd previously declined, exhibitions, launch cocktails, happy hours. She said she needed to expand her network, which was important for her professional growth. Ethan understood. He trusted her. He always had. He was a man of few words and abundant faith. He believed that true love was like this, secure, even in silence. Strong, even in absence. Nights at home began to grow lonelier. Ethan ate dinner alone more often, but he didn't complain. He prepared food and left a plate in the fridge with a note saying, "I love you." Some returned with a scrawled, "Thank you." Others went nowhere. He accepted it as part of the process. Love, he thought, was also made of gray periods. And he continued to believe that the sun would return. They were both at that point where they still loved each other, but no longer knew how to express it clearly. A dangerous point. The love still existed, but in a state of inertia. And it was there, in that nameless silence, that the most misguided decisions were often made. It was during this period that Ethan received an invitation to an important business meeting at a fancy restaurant. It was something big, with the possibility of a promotion. Clara said she was happy for him, wished him luck, and headed off to another of her social engagements. Ethan put on his best shirt, arranged his presentation papers, and left the house, believing that this would be just another night. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of the end. And what Ethan didn't know yet, was that that very night, at another table in the same restaurant, a familiar presence was waiting to be discovered, and that when he opened his eyes, he would no longer be the man he knew, but someone he never imagined he would be. The invitation to the business dinner arrived one random afternoon via a notification on his phone, and Ethan barely had time to digest its importance before being swallowed up by the hectic schedule that awaited him. The chosen restaurant was sophisticated, discreet, and frequented only by executives and important clients. It was the kind of setting where everything is calculated, from the yellowish lighting that softens tired expressions to the decorated dishes that disguise nervousness. For Ethan, that evening represented not only an opportunity for career advancement but also a chance to rediscover his own confidence, something that lately seemed to be slipping through his fingers with the insane pace of their relationship, which was no longer the same. Clara wished him luck with a light kiss and an absent smile, distracted by choosing a dress for the architecture event to which she had been invited. He didn't notice the haste in her gesture, nor the discomfort in her gaze that avoided his. He had grown accustomed to the distance, like someone growing accustomed to living with a chronic headache. That night, he arrived early at the restaurant. He was shown to a table in the corner, near the window. He took off his blazer, checked his papers, and took a deep breath. He ordered a glass of water. While waiting for the other guests, he took his phone out of his pocket to check if Clara had sent him a message. No notifications. He wasn't surprised. He was focused. He wanted everything to be perfect. And everything seemed headed that way until, as he glanced to the side out of sheer boredom, his eyes fell on a familiar silhouette. Sitting a few tables away, with her back to him, was Clara. Her hair was elegantly tied back, and she wore a black dress he didn't recognize, with a discreet, sophisticated neckline, the kind she didn't usually wear to work events. His blood ran cold before his brain could even construct a logical justification. Beside her, a man. Tall, well-dressed, gesturing as he said something that made her smile in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months. Her smile was light, knowing, intimate. The kind of smile reserved for those you desire. He blinked in disbelief, and for a moment he thought he was mistaken. Maybe it was just someone who looked similar. But when she turned her head slightly to look around, their eyes met. Clara stood still. The color drained from her face as if someone had extinguished the flame within her. Ethan's expression hardened, and all the warmth he'd felt moments before vanished. He didn't immediately stand up. He stood still, watching. He wanted to understand. He wanted an explanation that would make sense of everything. But there was nothing to justify it. The man beside her sensed the tension, but he couldn't bring himself to face it. He lowered his eyes uncomfortably and fiddled with the glass in front of him as if that would be enough to escape the scene. Ethan then stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to their table with slow, steady steps. Clara kept her eyes fixed on his. She didn't apologize, didn't try to explain, didn't say a word. She was pale, but her posture was frozen, almost proud. The silence that fell across the table was more deafening than any shout. Ethan just stared at her for a few long seconds, and then said a single sentence, "I understand." Then he turned and left the restaurant unhurriedly, like someone carrying an entire world crumbling on their back and still keeping their spine straight. The drive home seemed longer than ever. The steering wheel slipped in his sweaty hands, his heart beat out of rhythm, and his thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of images, voices, and memories. His head ached, his chest burned, but he didn't cry. The pain hadn't yet found an escape. Arriving home, he turned on all the living room lights, took off his shoes, sat on the couch, and stared into space for hours. He didn't turn on the television, didn't touch his phone. He just sat there, immersed in a void he couldn't escape. After a while, he went to his bedroom, opened the closet, and grabbed a suitcase. He threw some clothes in there haphazardly, simply to fill the space. He didn't know if he was going to leave or if he simply needed to feel the movement. The dawn crept in slowly, sharply. Every second was a stab of reality. Around 2 a.m, she heard the key turn in the door. Clara entered with timid, almost hesitant steps. Seeing him sitting on the sofa, she stopped. She hadn't expected him to still be there. She'd rehearsed her speech on the way back, but when she found him with his sunken eyes and unwavering expression, everything she'd thought vanished. She sat in the opposite chair, saying nothing. The silence stretched on for a few more minutes, until she finally murmured that she was sorry. She said it wasn't what it seemed. That she'd been mistaken. That he, the man in the restaurant, was making her feel noticed again, desired. Ethan didn't react. He listened to everything with a blank expression. When she finished, he stood, walked to his suitcase in the bedroom, zipped it, returned to the living room, and said, "Then our marriage ends here. You can move on with him. But don't look for me anymore." And he left. The following days were silent. Ethan rented a small apartment near work. He spent his time immersed in spreadsheets, emails, and goals. His impassive face hid a soul in ruins. At night, he returned home, took off his shoes in the entryway, and threw himself on the couch with the exhaustion of someone who had fought off a hurricane. He didn't eat well. He slept little. But he kept going. Clara tried to contact him. She sent messages, emails, even flowers. But he didn't respond. He erased each attempt like someone erasing a toxic memory. There was no room for a fresh start. Clara, for her part, believed she was making a courageous decision. She thought that by following that impulse, she would find a new kind of happiness. That the sparkle in the other man's eyes was what was missing in her life. For the first few days, she was ecstatic about the newness. She received messages every day, impromptu lunches, and lively conversations. But as time passed, the charm faded. The man who had seemed so involved, so attentive, began to seem distant. The dates dwindled. The compliments ceased. The plans evaporated. Before Clara knew it, she was alone. She tried to chase. She called, she insisted, she sought reunions that never came. And then she understood, it wasn't love. It was distraction. It was vanity. It was a game where she never knew the rules. Everything fell apart silently, just as it had with Ethan. But the difference was that now she was alone, with the weight of her own choices, trying to rebuild a castle made of wet sand. It was only then that she decided to look for Ethan. Not out of pride, but out of longing. Not out of need, but out of regret. She arrived at the door of his new apartment with red eyes, a choked voice, and trembling hands. He opened the door in surprise, stared at her for a few seconds, and then let her in. They sat on the couch like two strangers. She spoke. She asked for forgiveness. She said she'd made a mistake. That she missed him. That she now understood what she'd lost. Ethan listened to it all, silently. When she finished, he stood, looked at her tenderly, and said he forgave her. But he couldn't go back. She tried to argue. She said she could win him back. That she was willing to start over from scratch. But he shook his head. He said there was no more room. That love had changed. That now there was someone else in her life. Someone who arrived slowly, lightly, and filled the spaces she herself had left empty. Clara broke down. She cried right there, without hiding it. And in that cry there was more than pain, there was the awareness of what could not be undone. But she still didn't know everything. She still had no idea what had happened behind the scenes, what Ethan had discovered in the weeks they'd been apart, the crucial detail that would completely change the way she saw what she'd experienced, and most importantly, what she'd lost. A secret buried beneath his silence, yet to emerge. And when it did, it would turn regret into ruin. Because pain doesn't always end when the truth emerges. Sometimes, that's when it begins. Clara hadn't slept in days. Insomnia gripped her nights like a silent punishment, restless, relentless. The weight of regret, of the wrong choice, slowly consumed her, like an internal rust that corroded what she once thought was conviction. The walls of her apartment rang hollow, the paintings she had once hung with joy now seemed to mock her loneliness. There was no longer the sound of footsteps in the kitchen, nor the jingle of keys in the door, nor that muffled laughter coming from the other room. There was silence. A silence that screamed. And it was in this emptiness that she dreamed of Ethan. She dreamed of his calm voice, his sincere eyes, the way he looked at her when she felt small in the world. In her dreams, he still loved her. In her dreams, he still waited for her. But when she woke, all that remained was a cold pillow and a side of the bed that would never be occupied again. That Friday morning, Clara decided to look for Ethan one last time. She didn't have a clear plan. She didn't know exactly what she would say. But she needed to see him. She needed to tell him, somehow, that she still loved him, that she missed not just the routine or the comfort, but his essence, the look that made her feel the world was a little more bearable. She arrived at the building with her heart racing. Her hands were sweating and her fingers trembled as she pressed the elevator button. The apartment door opened after a few knocks, and there he was. More serene than she expected, but with a restrained expression, like someone guarding an ocean beneath a calm surface. She asked to come in. He hesitated for a moment, but stepped aside, allowing her entry. They sat in silence. There was a distance between their bodies that screamed. She began to speak, her voice choked, saying she recognized her mistake, that she had been fooled by a reflex, by a fleeting sense of novelty. Ethan didn't interrupt her. She just watched, with attentive eyes and a calm that disconcerted her. Clara spoke of the empty days, the lonely nights, how the other man was nothing more than a vain impulse, a blind detour that led nowhere. She said she saw everything clearly now. That she knew who the man was who had stood by her side through her darkest moments. That she finally understood the value of constancy, of presence, of truth. Ethan remained silent, simply listening. Until, at a certain point, he got up, went to the bedroom, and returned with a cardboard box. He handed it to her. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters. Not digital, but handwritten, in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. There were dozens of them. All dated. All kept. They were letters he'd written over the last 2 years, on nights when she arrived late, on early mornings when silence fell between them, on days when she seemed distant. He wrote and kept them. He never had the courage to give them to her. He felt she no longer listened with her heart. In one of them, written a few weeks before the separation, he said, "I feel like I'm slowly losing you, and the worst part is that you don't even notice. I try to reach you, but it feels like I'm screaming underwater. I love you, but I'm tired of not being heard." Tears began to stream down Clara's face, unstoppable. She read every word with searing pain. She never imagined he had felt so much. That he had tried so hard. She interrupted him and asked why he hadn't shown her before. Why he had kept all this quiet. He replied calmly, because he knew it wouldn't make a difference. That when someone has already decided to close their heart, no letter can get in. The silence settled again. She wanted to hug him, but didn't have the courage. It was then that he said there was something she needed to know. Something he had kept hidden out of respect, out of shame, out of pain. But now, faced with everything, he could no longer hide. Ethan said that the night he left home, he spent a few weeks trying to understand where he had gone wrong, whether he had been too absent, too cold, too distracted. And it was in this search that he decided to talk to their son. A 16-year-old, sensitive, observant, silent like his father. During a heart-to-heart conversation, the boy revealed that he had known about Clara's relationship with the other man for months. He had seen messages on her cell phone, overheard calls, caught them hugging in the car. And most painfully, Clara had instructed him not to tell his father. She had said it was just a friendship, that it was best for him to stay out of it, that his father wouldn't understand. The boy obeyed. He kept the secret like a burden, believing it would protect his mother. But it was eating away at him. And the day Ethan left home, the boy cried in his room, feeling complicit in something he didn't understand. When she heard that, Clara froze. Her breath caught in her chest. The world spun. The revelation struck like a bolt of lightning. Not only because her own son had sensed the betrayal, but because it had implicated him, made him carry such a heavy secret. She asked how he was, how he reacted, what he said. Ethan replied that he didn't talk about it. That since then, he'd become more introspective, more distant from his mother, more attached to his father. That he still loved her, but had lost trust. That the sparkle in her eyes when they spoke of her had disappeared. Clara broke down. She cried like she had never cried before. A primal, desperate cry, filled with guilt and despair. She fell to her knees on the floor, her hands on her face, begging for forgiveness, saying she never imagined the impact it would have. Ethan just watched. The scene before him brought no satisfaction. Only sadness. Because her pain was now the pain he already knew. She asked to see her son. He said he needed to explain, to apologize. Ethan agreed. He said he'd arrange a meeting, but he couldn't force it. That he'd have to be prepared. And before she left, Ethan said there was one more thing. He took out a small wooden box. She opened it and showed him her wedding ring. It was scratched, marked by time, but still intact. He said he kept it for a reason, to remember that true love is built with effort, with dedication, with daily choices. But also to remember that when you break, even if you stick together, it's never the same. That some cracks never disappear. Clara left that night without looking back. Carrying the guilt not only of the betrayal, but of the impact it had had on her own son's life, on the soul of a man who had loved her wholeheartedly, on the home she had destroyed with her own hands. And for the first time, she felt she had lost more than Ethan's love. She had lost the right to be part of the world she herself had chosen to abandon. And there was more. Much more. Because life hadn't ended there. And time would still show that some choices not only distance us from love, but change us forever. Days after that reunion, fraught with truths and silences, Clara isolated herself. She abandoned ongoing projects, ignored event invitations, blocked notifications on her phone, and avoided all contact with acquaintances. The shame was more piercing than the pain. For the first time, she felt there was no possible justification for what she had done. Not only had she lost the man who loved her with a rare intensity, but she had also betrayed something even purer, the trust of her own son. And from the moment she learned that he had carried that secret for months, without knowing the exact weight of what it meant, a new guilt arose within her. A guilt that could not be erased by regret. It was as if every heartbeat reminded her that she had caused a pain she never imagined causing. Ethan, for his part, after his revelation to Clara, resumed his life with the same silence as always, but now with the lightness of someone who had finally let go of the past. Although the scars were deep, there was a serenity in his eyes that had not existed before. The apartment was more organized, his routines became solid again, and the days, though discreet, had color. And there was someone. A discreet woman, whom he met in a leadership and communication course. Her name was Helena. It wasn't an instant romance, nor an intense one. But little by little, she entered his life with a gentleness he no longer knew he needed. Long conversations, shy laughter, a constant and gentle presence. Ethan wasn't in love as he once was, but he was at peace. And this peace was invaluable. Clara, aware of this, never tried to interfere. She knew it wasn't the right time, and perhaps never would be. But there was a pain she couldn't silence, the distance from her son. She tried calling him to talk several times. He responded politely, but dryly, curtly. They went days without speaking. When they arranged to meet, he avoided her gaze, kept his arms crossed, his words restrained. Clara tried to approach him lightly, tried to apologize, explain that everything happened in a moment of confusion. But he was direct, cutting, harsh in a way she never expected to hear. You could have wronged anyone, but putting me in the middle of this was cruel. You didn't just lie to your father, you lied to me. I trusted you. The words echoed in Clara's mind like a cold, constant echo. That sentence was the final blow. Because Clara could bear Ethan's separation, even though it hurt. But being rejected by her own son was an abyss. An abyss she had dug herself. It was then that she decided to walk away. She stopped insisting. She let him seek it whenever he wanted. She understood, for the first time, that forgiveness isn't demanded. Forgiveness is earned. And sometimes, you wait a lifetime for it to come. A few weeks later, Clara was invited to give a talk about mistakes that shape trajectories. The invitation had come from a former college classmate who had no idea what she was going through. Initially, he considered refusing. She felt completely unprepared to speak in public after everything. But there was something inside her urging her to transform that pain into something meaningful. On the day of the talk, she took the stage with a trembling voice, her eyes full, and her heart exposed. He didn't name names. He didn't point fingers. He simply told a story. His own. He spoke about how easily we abandon what is true in the name of fleeting sensations. About how vanity can blind us. About how much it hurts to look back and see that what was lost was all that truly mattered. In the end, she received a standing ovation. Not out of pity. But out of truth. Because even in silence, everyone knew, she was speaking of something many feel, but few admit. Weeks later, on a normal afternoon, her son came to her. He knocked on the door without warning. He was thinner, more serious. He entered without saying anything, and Clara remained motionless. He sat on the sofa, took a deep breath, and said he'd heard her talk. That someone had accidentally sent the link. He said he'd cried while watching. And that there, for the first time, he could see his mother behind the mistake. He said it still hurt. That he still felt anger, confusion, longing. But he wanted to try to start over. Not forget. But forgive little by little. And that, perhaps, one day, he could call her Mom again with the same affection as before. Clara wept silently. And in that moment, she felt that, even without Ethan, perhaps there was still a future where she could rebuild what she'd destroyed. Meanwhile, Ethan continued on his way. Helena was a companion, sensitive, respectful of his silences, and wise enough not to compete with the past. They traveled slowly, rediscovering small pleasures, and the bond between them grew slowly, like a root taking hold in the soil after a storm. Ethan didn't compare. He simply appreciated. And that made him feel lighter. One Saturday afternoon, watching Helena laugh with her son during a casual lunch, he realized something inside him was healing. It wasn't replacement. It was reconstruction. It was different, but it was true. Clara learned from third parties that Ethan was fine. That he had started smiling again. That her son was getting along well with his new girlfriend. She felt neither envy nor anger. She felt pain, but not resentment. It was her own pain, intimate, a consequence of her choices. And over time, she learned to live with it. She opened a small design consultancy, went back to school, and went to therapy. She became more introspective, less impulsive. She still loved Ethan. But she understood that love doesn't guarantee a return. And, above all, that love without care sustains nothing. The final reunion happened without warning, months later. It was an ordinary afternoon, in a random supermarket. Ethan was with Helena, choosing wines. Clara wandered in by chance, looking for ingredients for a solitary dinner. When their eyes met, it was as if time stood still. Ethan smiled discreetly. Helena, sensing the mood, politely stepped aside. Clara walked over to him. They simply said, "Hi." She asked how he was. He said fine. She commented that her son seemed calmer. Ethan nodded. There was a silence between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a silence of respect. Then Clara said, her voice firm and sweet, "Thank you for everything. Including for teaching me to understand what love is." Ethan replied calmly, "You taught me too. The difference is that I learned after the pain." And then they said goodbye. No hugs. No promises. No hope. Just the certainty that they were important to each other, even if the ending wasn't what they'd dreamed. Clara returned home with a lighter feeling of emptiness. Ethan left with the feeling that the cycle had closed. Each moved on. One with someone new. The other with themselves. And both, with a lesson that would last forever. Because sometimes, the true climax of life is not the explosion, but the silence that comes after it. The supermarket aisle became an unexpected scene of closure. Those few minutes where eyes met, words were spoken unhurriedly, and silence was embraced with maturity marked not only the end of a cycle, but the beginning of a new perspective for each of them. Ethan drove home that day in silence, driving slowly through familiar streets, with Helena beside him, serene as ever, and his son sitting in the back seat, listening to music through headphones. There was no need to explain what had happened. Helena, sensitive as she was, knew a knot was being unraveled. And the more mature son simply looked up in the rearview mirror and met his father's, as if sharing a silent understanding of everything they had experienced. Clara, as she closed the door that same night, felt something inside her finally accept what she had been so reluctant to accept. There was no going back. And this, though painful, brought a strange sense of relief. That chapter of her life had concluded. Not with the ending she dreamed of, but with the necessary outcome so that her story could continue in another way. The days that followed were filled with emotional reorganization. Clara immersed herself in personal projects, returned to drawing as she had in her early years of college, began frequenting less crowded cafes, and allowed herself to enjoy the sound of rain against the windows, as she hadn't done in a long time. She traded her cell phone for books, her TV shows for walks, her empty meetings for solitary, meaningful afternoons. It wasn't a sudden redemption, nor an emotional miracle. It was a slow, painful, and intimate reconstruction, done with the care of someone dealing with broken pieces and trying, piece by piece, to assemble a more honest version of herself. Some days, everything seemed fine. On others, the guilt would bite back. But now she was learning to live with it, without denying it, without running away, simply allowing it to be part of the new version she was building. And the hardest part of all was no longer trying to convince anyone of her regret. Simply living in harmony with it. Ethan, for his part, maintained his steady pace. His relationship with Helena was maturing in a balanced way, without pressure or unnecessary demands. It was different from what he'd had with Clara, but not inferior. It was a different kind of connection, more serene, more caring. And that was exactly what he needed at that moment. His son, now with a lighter countenance, became increasingly more of a partner in the routines, in the small daily rituals that were gradually returning to what was once called home. They cooked together on Sundays, watched old movies the boy discovered out of curiosity, and laughed at simple things, rediscovering the pleasure of being together without the weight of a past that had previously suffocated them. There was no intention of replacing memories, but there was a mutual desire to create new ones. And that, in itself, was a big step. The complexity of Clara's moral dilemma, however, took on deeper layers. Because, even accepting her losses, she still carried the feeling that her punishment was memory. The memory of what she destroyed, what she caused her son, what she lost with Ethan, what could have been. And this awareness prevented her from allowing herself anything new. She tried dating a coworker or two, accepted invitations for casual dates, but none of them lasted longer than coffee. It was as if every face reminded her that she had not yet completely forgiven herself. And while this persisted, no other bond would truly blossom. The pain of loss was profound, but genuine repentance prevented her from living superficially. The greater dilemma was no longer earning the forgiveness of others, but finding a possible peace within herself, a truce with her own conscience. One night, Clara received a message from her son. It was direct, blunt, "I want to talk." They arranged to meet at a park they used to go to when he was little. She arrived first, sat on the wooden bench under the big tree, and waited. He appeared shortly after, his hands in his pockets and his expression calmer. He sat beside her and remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said he had thought a lot about everything. That he no longer wanted to live trapped in a hurt. That it still hurt, but he didn't want to carry it for the rest of his life. Clara listened to every word as if listening to music. It was as if the whole world fell silent just so she could imprint that moment on her memory. He said he needed her at certain points in his life, that he still saw incredible qualities in her, and that if she was willing to rebuild trust little by little, he was open to it. Clara couldn't hold back her tears. She didn't say much, just nodded and held his hand. It was the beginning of a new bridge, built with much more care. Meanwhile, Ethan received an invitation for a weekend trip with Helena and her son. It was a secluded, peaceful place, surrounded by nature, without much cell phone signal. He decided to accept. They set off on a Friday afternoon, with little luggage and open hearts. During the trip, they talked about everything, laughed at old memories, and shared thoughts about the future. At one point, by a lake, while his son explored a trail and Helena rested under a tree, Ethan was alone with his thoughts. He remembered everything he'd been through, everything he'd lost, and everything he now had. And there, in that silent, calm moment, he understood that, although some wounds leave scars, they also indicate places one should never tread again. He got up, walked over to Helena, and sat beside her. She looked at him and smiled. He simply said, "Thank you for not trying to fix me." She replied, "You didn't need to be fixed, you just needed space to heal." He held her hand and felt that, finally, the cycle was complete. The following week, Clara was invited to give another lecture, this time to a group of young university students. The topic was paths back. She considered refusing. She still felt she didn't have much to teach. But something inside her insisted that perhaps this was the moment. She took the stage, looked at those dozens of attentive faces, and began to tell her story. No frills, no dramatizations. Just the raw truth. She said that everyone makes mistakes, but that some mistakes are costly. She said that, even after pain, it's still possible to rebuild something within oneself. That sometimes forgiveness comes from without, but what's most important is what comes from within. And that life, while it doesn't erase scars, always offers a new chance to walk differently. She was applauded, again. And this time, as she stepped off the stage, she felt less guilty and more grateful. For the pain, for the learning, for the second chance with her son, for the reunion with a part of herself she had forgotten existed. Clara and Ethan never saw each other again after that day at the supermarket. They didn't exchange messages, didn't revisit memories. But they both knew, deep down, that they were connected by a story that, though over, left deep scars. And in those scars was a kind of respect that time cannot erase. They knew they would never be the same. But they also knew that somehow they became better. Not because of the pain, but because of everything they chose to do after it. And so, the story reached its final page. Not as an open scar, nor as a romantic ending. But as a whole truth, felt, lived, and understood. Because sometimes, life's greatest dilemma isn't losing someone. It's finding yourself afterward. And finally, after all, they were ready to move on. Each in their own way. Each in their own time. But finally, free. The morning after the lecture, Clara woke with a different feeling. For the first time in a long time, the crushing weight of guilt disappeared as soon as she opened her eyes. There was, indeed, a kind of gentle melancholy, like a distant echo of the pain that had long been dominant, but now it no longer occupied the same space. Something new was emerging, an almost strange sense of acceptance. She stared at the ceiling for a few minutes and realized she no longer felt the need to justify the past or beg for understanding. She had done what she could. Now, all that was left to do was move on. She spent the day organizing the closets in her small apartment, sorting out objects that no longer made sense, storing others more carefully, purging physical memories that seemed to insist on lingering. Finding an old sketchbook, she opened it out of curiosity. Among the drawings scribbled on yellowed paper was a self-portrait she'd done years before, a light, delicate line, but with intense eyes. She realized that the face seemed to belong to another woman. Not because of its appearance, but because of the energy it exuded. She didn't want to go back to being that woman, but she wanted to reclaim what was most true in her, the courage to show herself as she is, without hiding behind other people's idealizations or desires. Meanwhile, Ethan was experiencing a new moment with Helena. Their relationship, previously marked by subtlety and prudence, was now beginning to deepen. It was no longer just the comfort of their presence or the lightness of their days. It was the construction of real plans. Together, they decided to renovate a small cottage in a remote area, inherited from Helena's grandparents. Little by little, that place began to become more than a refuge. It was the symbol of a new beginning, but a conscious new beginning, based no longer on impulsive promises, but on careful choices. One rainy weekend, as they were organizing paint and wood for a new painting, Helena approached Ethan, her hands stained with color, and said with a sincere smile that, even without knowing everything about his past, even without fully understanding the story that had made him so restrained, she felt he was whole now. And that was enough. Ethan replied that, for a long time, he had feared the past was a constant shadow. But now he realized that, in fact, the past was the solid ground that kept him from falling into the same abyss again. And this realization made him stronger, more stable, more present. Across town, Clara received an unexpected invitation. She was from a visual arts school, offering a position as a mentor for young talent. Someone had attended her lecture and put her forward. The proposal involved short trips, meetings with budding artists, and an exchange of experiences. Something she never imagined she would experience. For a few minutes, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to put herself out there again, to guide young people with such delicate dreams. But upon rereading the proposal, she felt this could be the missing step. She accepted. In the following weeks, she traveled to small towns, taught workshops, listened to stories of insecure young people, shared experiences, laughed, and was moved. She discovered that, even with so many flaws, she still had something to offer. And this filled a space within her that had long been empty. One night, after one of these meetings, she received a message from her son. It was a photo of a project he had presented at school. In the background, a bold phrase was written: "Mistakes don't define who we are, but what we do after them defines who we can become." Clara read and reread that sentence for minutes. She didn't respond immediately. She put away her phone and remained silent, gazing at the starry sky from the terrace of the hotel where she was staying. She cried. But it was a different kind of cry. It wasn't of pain or guilt. It was of gratitude. For a second chance. For the wisdom that only time brings. For the possibility of being better with each new day, even if the past still silently accompanied her. At the cottage, the construction was nearly complete. Ethan and Helena decided to hold a small gathering with friends and family to celebrate. It was simple, yet symbolic. During dinner, while everyone chatted amid the dim lights and the soft sound of an old record player, Ethan observed. He didn't actively participate in the conversations, but he absorbed everything intensely. At one point, a friend approached and commented on how different he seemed, how much lighter he felt. Ethan smiled and replied that, for the first time, he was living a chapter that didn't need to erase any other to exist. It wasn't about replacing, but about continuing. And in that moment, this continuity made sense. Weeks later, Clara received a special invitation from a gallery to exhibit some of the work of the young people she had mentored. It wasn't her art, but it was her contribution. And that was immensely valuable. During the opening, she walked among the works with a proud and calm look. She was approached by a man who recognized her from the talk. He said her talk had helped his daughter escape an abusive relationship. That her words had been a trigger for courage. Clara thanked him, moved. She returned home that night with the feeling that, even without having all her ties restored, she had found real purpose. One afternoon, while drinking coffee on a park bench, Clara saw Ethan and his son pass by on the other side of the street. They were laughing, carefree. They didn't see her. And she didn't call out. She just watched. There was, in that moment, an almost poetic tranquility. Because she knew that true love doesn't need to be present to be eternal. And that, even if they no longer shared paths, she would always carry a piece of them within her. She smiled slightly and went on her way. Days later, on a sunny Sunday, while arranging books on her bookshelf, she found an old letter Ethan had written but never sent. It was short. It simply said, "If one day everything falls apart, I hope you know that, even though I was hurt, I loved with all my strength." And that, in itself, was true enough. Clara reread it several times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in a box that also contained old photos, her son's drawings, and letters from young artists. It was her box of truths. And there, everything made sense. Because despite everything, she was no longer the woman who had made a mistake. She was the woman who chose to transform that mistake into a path. Ethan and Helena decided to travel together for a month. They went abroad to see new places and experience different cultures. It was their first major trip since they began dating. During their stay, they sent some photos to their son, who responded with short but affectionate messages. It was clear that, even without anyone demanding anything, a new family structure was being built. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about allowing the present to have its place. Clara learned about the trip from her own son's comments. And she didn't feel jealous. Nor pain. She felt something close to pride. Pride in seeing that the man she had emotionally destroyed was able to rebuild an entire life with dignity, without turning to stone, without taking revenge, without disrespecting his own history. In the days that followed, time passed more smoothly. Clara continued with her routine, with her mentoring sessions, with her silences transformed into art. Ethan lived his days with Helena, with his son, with his friends, with the work that had become a pleasure again. And the world didn't stop. It simply found a new rhythm. And in time with that rhythm, they both kept moving. In opposite directions, perhaps. But with the same strength that arises when one survives something that seemed impossible to bear. Because there is pain that doesn't kill, but molds. And they, shaped by pain, found better versions of themselves. Not to return. But to move on. Truly. Time followed its course as naturally as the seasons change without asking permission. Cycles closed silently, with only the subtlety of someone who understands that the end of a story doesn't have to be tragic to be memorable. Clara established herself as a mentor and speaker, traveling to different cities, sharing her experiences with an increasingly diverse audience. With each new presentation, her gaze grew firmer, not because she had completely healed, but because she learned to live with the pain without letting it paralyze her. One autumn afternoon, after a talk at a small cultural center, a young woman approached to thank her. She said she was about to cheat on her partner, feeling bored and needy, but after listening to Clara, she decided against it. She understood that moments of emptiness cannot be filled with destructive decisions. Clara listened silently, then smiled with a lump in her throat. She returned to the hotel and, alone, cried with a mixture of relief and sadness. Not for what he no longer had, but for what he could still do with what was left. Ethan, on the other hand, lived the following years in serenity. The renovated house became his new home, where he and Helena built a peaceful life, without haste or pressure. His relationship with his son matured into complicity. They shared not only moments, but also responsibilities, projects, and new memories. The past, once painful, began to be remembered with a kind of respect. No longer as something to be erased, but as an essential part of the story that brought them to this point. At an anniversary dinner, surrounded by friends and family, Ethan made a silent toast. He discreetly raised his glass, looked at his son and Helena, and thought he would never have imagined finding peace after so much chaos. But it was there, not as a prize, but as the fruit of the right choices after a profound abyss. The son, now a young adult, chose to study psychology. He wanted to understand human relationships, trauma, and the reasons behind the behaviors that had so profoundly affected him. He never spoke openly to Clara again about the episode that had driven them apart, but he resumed inviting her for occasional coffees, texting her on special occasions, and sharing smiles during brief encounters. It was a slow rebuilding process, without urgency, but with affection. In a conversation with his father, he confided that he still felt the impact of what he experienced, but that time had taught him that people make mistakes not out of malice, but out of fear, insecurity, or lack of clarity. He said that maturity comes when you learn to set boundaries without holding grudges. Ethan listened with silent pride. He saw in his son a strength that even he himself hadn't known he had instilled. Years passed. Clara aged with dignity. Her hair grew silver, her hands became slower, but her mind was more lively than ever. He continued to travel, albeit less frequently. One cold morning, while visiting a school in the countryside, she felt slightly dizzy. She was treated promptly, without any major complications. The doctor said it was just fatigue and recommended rest. He returned home and decided to write a letter. It was to Ethan. Not to reopen wounds, but to record everything he'd never had the courage to say clearly. He recounted what it was like to live with emptiness, how he remained present in every decision, how he tried to rebuild himself without forgetting what he'd done. He said he didn't expect an answer, nor forgiveness, nor return. I just wanted him to know that, despite everything, I still loved him. Not with the same urgency as before, but with a mature, quiet, and deep love. He didn't send the letter. He put it in a drawer with other mementos. Helena and Ethan decided not to officially marry. They didn't need a ceremony to validate their feelings. They shared more than just love, they shared their daily lives with ease. She helped him understand his own limitations, and he made her feel safer than ever before. One starry night, sitting on the porch, they talked about how life had surprised them. Helena confessed that when she met Ethan, she thought he would never open his heart completely. But now she saw a whole man in him. Ethan replied that if she knew how much her presence healed parts he believed were lost, she would understand that it wasn't he who allowed love, it was she who showed him the way back. Clara, now more reclusive, began writing her memoirs. A book she hadn't intended to publish, but which helped her organize her feelings. He described in detail not only the events, but the thoughts that preceded them, the justifications he used, the fears he ignored. I wanted someone to read it, to see a raw portrait of human complexity. One day, her son found the manuscript on the table during a visit. He read a few pages without her noticing. As he was about to leave, he left a note, "Now I understand more than before. I still don't know if I forgive everything, but I admire your courage in exposing yourself. That, too, is love." Clara read it and, for the first time, felt that, even without complete retribution, there was connection. Life didn't bring final twists and turns. There was no romantic reconciliation between Clara and Ethan, nor any dramatic encounters in the final years. They moved on. With memories that sometimes hurt, sometimes warmed. The past remained where it should, like a book already read, full of notes in the margins. Both grew old aware of their flaws, but also their strengths. Each, in their own way, found peace. And that, after all, was the greatest triumph possible. Now that you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment and share your opinion, it's very important to us. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and follow other impactful stories like this one. This narrative shows us, with rawness and sensitivity, how betrayal goes far beyond a momentary slip. It corrodes bonds, destroys structures, and tears apart affections. But it also reveals the power of starting over, the power of sincere repentance, and the human capacity to learn from the consequences. Because love, when betrayed, can be forgiven, but it is rarely restored in the same way. The scars remain. And every choice carries a price. Never forget, this channel does not, in any way, support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell fictional stories that carry emotional truths to raise awareness, reflect, and, most importantly, teach that respect, loyalty, and dialogue are non-negotiable pillars of true love. Until the next story.